There was a quote by Flannery O'Connor that has been making the rounds recently that, given the climate of outrage and scandal in the church right now, I thought was really apt. It said something like, all good Catholics become anti-clerical sooner or later. It is an honorable and noble tradition. There's a kind of absurd irony in the fact that so many of the voices and factions within the church that have been calling for dissent from Catholic teaching for decades now are suddenly utterly convinced that nothing less than absolute loyalty to the Pope is required for anyone who expects to be able to raise their hand in the roll call of those who identify as Catholic. But that's a really difficult about turn to make. You can't sow the seeds of dissent for so long and then suddenly you make an about turn when your own message starts to cannibalize you and say that you can't criticize the Pope and still call yourself Catholic. Well, I'm not sure what criticisms about Pope Francis are valid at the time I'm recording this, but I do think it's worth considering whether or not dissent of any kind is valid in the Catholic Church, and if so, what are its limits, if any? There are a lot of ideas and assertions that people will call Catholic teaching, and some of those things are more clear than others. So you'll get some people who will say that certain things don't need to be adhered to or are open to interpretation, and then you'll get other people who will say that those same things are binding doctrines. And it's in that context that some people will wedge themselves in there, people who are intent on undermining the church, and start to sow a lot of confusion. But there's a very disruptive hard fact in the midst of that, and that's the doctrine of papal infallibility. Unlike some of the other teachings, it can't be dragged into the fog of uncertainty. It's a definite doctrine. There's no ambiguity about it. Where there is a lot of confusion is in what it means. And so a lot of people will point to things that the Pope might have said in a press conference or popes in the past who have behaved really badly and say, you see, there's no way that doctrine could be true. But that's not what the doctrine means. It doesn't mean that everything the Pope says is infallible or that he will always behave impeccably. It means that when the Pope defines a doctrine for the whole church about faith and morals, and when he delivers it in a very specific way called ex-cathedra, that he is preserved from error by God. Even though papal infallibility has to be one of the most bold claims to authority in all of humanity, the church's definition of it is pretty toned down to the way that the Bible describes it. It's almost as if Jesus wanted to emphasize this point in the most dramatic fashion possible. And so in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus addresses Simon and renames him Peter, or Kepha in Aramaic, which means rock. And then he says to him, without changing the point of address, he says that upon this rock I will build my church, and I give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. In other words, your authority to define what is true and good is so absolute that heaven itself will be compromised if you get it wrong. Now, considering that God has a vested interest in the integrity of heaven, I'm guessing that he'll probably use some of that omnipotent power of his to make sure that Peter and his successors don't try to define a heretical doctrine. And again, the church's way of describing this is really toned down and modest compared to the way that Jesus did it. Jesus was no stranger to hyperbole when it was needed, and he really doesn't soften the point on this. So if you consider yourself a Christian or a follower of Jesus, then there really isn't much flexibility on this question. You either listen to what he said and follow it, or you don't. And that's an important ultimatum, because to consider yourself a follower of somebody is to admit that you don't have all the answers, and that you need the guidance of someone whose wisdom and knowledge exceeds your own. But if you're just picking and choosing from among the things that Jesus said, then you're not following him. You're following yourself. You're still deciding what is true and good. To only follow the things that suit your preferences or your assumptions is to not follow him. To head the other way when something is difficult for you to accept is to not follow him. It would be like calling yourself a strict follower of the rules of the road, but then disobeying them whenever it's convenient for you. You can't have it both ways. So to disregard the doctrinal teachings of the church, which trace themselves back to this exact teaching about binding and loosing, is to depart ways with Catholic Christianity. And I understand why it's difficult for some people to follow these teachings and why they might not want to. I wouldn't expect anyone to violate their conscience. But what I don't understand is when people want to dissent from these doctrinal teachings and still call themselves Catholic, or to even push an opposing view to these doctrines and to expect them to be changed in light of that. When a doctrine like papal infallibility is on the books, to expect the church to reverse any of its doctrines would be to try to build a church on a contradiction. It would be like cutting off the branch you're sitting on. You can't do that and expect the church to still be standing. It would represent its own collapse. And I get that a lot of people who insist on that contradiction haven't really thought it all the way through. They're just going along with their preferences or their assumptions. So I'm challenging you to think it through. That kind of dissent is a path to ruin for the church. It's not a path to reform or progress. It's the worst kind of regress. Christ built his church on a rock. It would be like pulling that rock out of the foundation and then being surprised when the whole thing comes crashing down. So what about dissent from other things that a bishop or the pope might advocate? Well, again, not everything the pope says or does is infallible. So there are reasonable grounds to correct or even oppose him. And precedents for this go all the way back to scripture. St. Paul rebuked St. Peter because of the way that he was treating Gentile converts. And nobody questioned St. Paul's faithfulness to the gospel or the church because of that incident. So while dissent from the doctrines of the church is to seek the ruin of what is known as Catholicism, dissent or opposition towards a bishop or a pope who is out of step with the timeless teachings of the church can, with diligent prayer and discernment, be a good thing. One is destructive in its approach, and the other is constructive. So as you can probably guess, it's really important that we can distinguish between them, given what's at stake. Thanks so much for watching, guys. If you enjoyed that, then please consider subscribing and liking, and come find me on Facebook and Twitter. It's a huge help when you do that. It helps us get these videos in front of more and more people. And a big thank you goes out to You Catholic for presenting these videos. And if you want to support the making of these videos, then please consider supporting my work as a digital media and marketing expert. My company, Holdsworth Design, specializes in branding, web and graphic design, marketing, social media, videography, and all that kind of good stuff. So if you know of a parish, a diocese, a ministry, or a business that needs help in those areas, then please send them our way, and I'm sure we can help them out.